Alright, my good friends, in this video we are going to be learning about the useContext hook. Now, what is the useContext hook? Let me just quickly describe what it is, and then we'll just get right into it, and you'll pretty much know what it is and why it's useful. So the useContext hook is a way that we can globally manage state in our application. When you think of state, probably the first thing that comes to mind is the useState hook. And I do expect you to know what the useState hook is if you are watching this video. And if you don't know that, pause the video. I do have a crash course on useState. But if you do know what it is, then please continue watching. So the useState hook, what it does is it manages state in the component level. However, it doesn't manage state in multiple components. Only that one component has that state. Now you can pass that state down through props to other components, and then they can have that state, if you will, through that prop. But really, that state is managed in that one component. However, maybe what we want is multiple components to have access to that state relatively easily without passing props. Well, in that case, we would use the useContext hook. Or potentially, if we have something more complicated, we would use the useReducer hook, which I'll have a crash course on in the future. But now we're going to be talking about useContext, and honestly, useContext, very, very simple. Really, really simple. It's not very difficult. So let's just get into it. So to kind of illustrate how important it might be to have global state, let's just go through kind of an example of a parent component that has many children components, and try to pass the state that is held in the parent component to the I guess the downmost child component. Let me just show you how kind of difficult that can be and how tedious it will be. So in here, I have a React application, and I went to the app.js, and I just completely wiped everything that was between these divs. So I completely got rid of everything else. I also have this components directory, and in here I have components with useState, components with useEffect. These are for my other crash courses, so you don't have to worry about that. All you want to do is just create a components directory, and if you want to follow along with the useContext, what I want you, instead of creating a file, I want you to create a folder. And I want you to say this one, components with useContext. So this one is components with useContext, and in here, what I want you to create is a parent.js. So over here, we're going to create this parent, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function-based component. So let's go about doing that right now. So a function-based component is relatively simple. Let's just export default, and of course, you probably know that because this is a hook, this has to be in a function-based component. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a very, very simple counter inside of this parent. So we're just going to say it's counter. We can call it app or whatever it is that we want, but I'm going to call it counter. So let's go here, counter. I'm going to make this a functional based component. And what I'm going to do is let's just go about and let's import the useState hook, and let's just create a regular counter. This is very knowledge I would expect you guys to have. You know, I'd be expecting you to know how to create a simple counter with useState. So let's just go here. Let's just return some JSX. We'll just return some div here. And then inside of the div, maybe we'll have an h1. And this is where we'll have the count. And maybe we'll also have a button over here. And this button is in charge of adding to that count. So the first thing we need to do is we need to use that useState hook. So let's just say count, set count. Oopsie daisy, set count. And over here, we're going to say equals to useState. And initially, we're going to give it a value of 0. And so over here, we're just going to render whatever that count is. Very, very simple. And then over here inside of the add button, we're going to have to add an onClick. So onClick. We're going to have an arrow function in here. So it's going to call this function. We're going to do just set count. And then we're going to do count plus 1. Very, very simple. And now what we're going to do is very quickly just go to the app.js And in here, we're just going to render that parent component. Now notice that it auto imported, which is terrific. If it didn't, you're gonna have to manually import it. All right, cool. So it says here counter is not defined. So maybe I have some error here. And honestly, we should probably call this parent because this is really the parent. Now, why is counter? So over here, okay. So we're just going to do export default, and this should be a function. Let's just make it a function instead of a arrow. There we go. This should work. Okay, cool. All right, so that works. So now if we were to run this, I'm running this on localhost 3000, do yarn start or npm run start to start it, and we should get this very simple application. Okay, very cool. So really simple. I mean, it adds, it works. That's terrific. That's exactly what we wanted. Now, let's say that we have multiple children. So notice that this state over here is inside of the parent component. So it's inside of this parent component. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create multiple children. So let's go inside of this directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a children folder. So I'm going to create a children folder. And in here, we're going to have a lot of repetitive code. In here, I'm going to create 5 different children. So I'm going to say children1.js, and let's just go ahead and let's just create the boilerplate for child 1 so that we don't have to do it for each one. So we can just copy and paste. So let's just do a quick functional based component. We're going to say export default, and we're going to say child1. And maybe children1 is not the best name for this. Let's just rename this to child1. So child1. And what we want to do is we want to return some JSX, of course. And let's give this a class. We're going to give this a class of childbox1. And so childbox1, if you go to the app.css, go to my GitHub repo, and then scroll in the app.css, go to the useContext styles over here, and just copy all those styles from this comment to this comment over here, and just put them in your app.css. So over here, all we're doing is we're creating a box. So this is a box with a height and width of 500 pixels. We have a border, and then we also have margin for this one, and we also give it a background color. And you can see that each box is just a little bit smaller. So you can see that each box is going to be a little bit smaller. Really, you don't have to worry about the styles. I just put it in there for sakes, whatever. I put it in there. Okay, so that's the first child, and that's really pretty much all we have to do for all the other children. So let's go here and let's create child2.js, and then let's change this to child2, change the styles to child2, save that, and then over here let's create another child, child3.js. I know this is, I haven't really touched the context part of it yet, but trust me, I just really want to illustrate how valuable this is, how valuable context can be. So I'm going to have to go through this kind of tedious setup, but we're almost done. So we're going to do child4, and then over here, let's add another child, and we're going to say child5.js. So child5, and then over here, change that to 5, change this to 5. Very, very simple. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want the parent to render child1, and then I want child1 to render child2, and then child2 to render 3, and then 4, and then 5. So child5 is going to be actually a child of child4, and then child4 is going to be a child of this, and then that. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to begin with child1. So let's just go ahead and let's render child1. Let's just see where I exactly want to render it. I am going to render it right above this counter. So let's completely neglect the count. And what I want to do is I want to render component, or not component, child1. So child1, unfortunately, did not auto import. So I'm going to have to auto import it myself. Very unfortunate. Very, very unfortunate. Really don't like that. So we're just going to say child1 from, and we're going to go here to the children directory, and we're going to get child1. Okay, cool. So we're going to render that. And then child 1, what it's going to do is going to render child 2. So let's just see. Hopefully this auto imports. I really do hope so. It does. Terrific. So save that. And then child 2 is going to render child 3. Child 3. Auto imports. Terrific. Exactly what I wanted. Over here, child 3 is going to render child 4. And this kind of seems like a tedious example, but this is very typical in a real large React application. We're going to have a parent, and that parent is going to have a child, and then that child's going to have a child. So we're going to have a lot of different components that are high up, and then a lot of components that are way down. Hopefully that made sense. Made sense in my head. Okay, so let's just do child 3 here. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And oh, nope. This should be child 5 actually. Child 4 should render child 5. We're gonna have a loop. Not good. All right, and that's pretty much it. And so now you can see, if I were to refresh this, we shouldn't see our count anymore. Seems like we might have a render loop actually. So let me, child 1 renders child 2, child 2 renders child 3, child 3 renders child 4, yeah, I think that should be good. I'm not really sure why that's stalling. Let's just cut it and let's run it again. Hopefully that works out. Starting development server. Okay, cool. And this is exactly what we get. So this is right here what we get. Terrific. So you might be thinking, okay, why do we get this? Well, the reason why we get this is because of the style. So I made this upper box. So this is child 1 over here. This is child 2, child 3, child 4, child 5. So this is exactly what we get. And the reason why I want to show you this is I really want to illustrate how this parent-child relationship is working. So over here we have this whole box over here is the parent. So this whole thing is the parent. And over here, this is child 1. But you can see it's the parent of all these other ones. So over here, child 2 is being rendered inside of child 1. Then child 3 is rendered inside of child 2. Child 4 is rendered here. And then child 5 is rendered here. Okay, cool. So what I'm also going to do is inside of the parent, let's just go ahead and let's have an H1 in there. And I'm also going to display the count. I'm going to display the count. All right, so we should see the count here. And if we were to add it, terrific. Now let's actually start diving into the solution that the useContext solves. So now let's say that, okay, this piece of state is very, very important and is needed by child 1, and child 5. So it's needed by child 1 and child 5. So how do we do that right now? With our current setup, what we would have to do is, okay, well, child 1 needs the state. Okay, no problem. So what I can do is just pass it as a prop. So I can say count is equal to count. And then over here, I can just say, I can get the prop, I can destructure the prop. And then over here, what I can do is maybe below this, I can just render whatever it is that the prop is. So I can just say H1, and then inside of the H1, we can just say count. So inside of the H1, we can say count. I just want to make sure over here what let's also give this a class name. I was just trying to make sure what that class name was. We're going to say box header, and then that's it. Okay, cool. So now you can see that this child, this one over here, also has this state, which is exactly what we wanted. We wanted this one to have this state. Now we also want child 5 to have this state. Now if we were to add it, it also changes. Terrific. But again, we also want this one over here to do that. Now, okay, so how am I going to pass this state to this child? Unfortunately, if you go back to child 1, there's no reference to child 5 because it's not a direct child. The real child that it's rendering is child 2. So really the only way that we can pass this piece of state here is to pass this state to child 2, and then child 2 passes it to child 3 passes it to child 4 passes it to child 5. So let's just do that, and this is not a good approach, because this is known as prop drilling. So we're drilling props in so we can get it to the component that is needed. And really, at that point, there's going to be a lot of props that are unnecessarily sent to some other children or other components in between. And that is ultimately not what we want. So let me just explain to you why, or let me just show you how we would do this. Very simply, we would just say, okay, count is equal to count. And then inside of child 2, we would just take that count, and then we would just say over here, count is equal to count, even though we're completely not using it in child 2. And then over here, we can just say, okay, child 3, count is equal to count. So you can see we're sending unnecessary data, and it's very tedious, and it can get very messy and not maintainable. And then over here in child 4, finally, we can just say count is equal to count. And then over here, we can just say count, destructure count out. And then lastly, we can just say an H1 here, because we want to render that in here. And we can say count. And then over here, let's just say class name. And then let's also give that the box header. And let's also, of course, destructure out the count. So this is, again, a very... like, you can do it this way, not a good way, because we're doing prop drilling. Prop drilling is not good. So how could we solve this issue? So when we have a lot of components, and a lot of components that are down the family tree that require a piece of state, it might be better to globally assign that state, and then whatever component needs it can just pick it up when it's needed, instead of performing these prop drilling. And that is where useContext comes in. So let's completely get rid of this prop drilling. So let's just go here, let's just clean up all the other components. So I'm gonna go here, just quickly clean everything up. We're not gonna pass that in anymore. I'm gonna show you a better way of doing things. Okay, so this is where useContext finally comes into place. So let's go here. Let's get rid of this. Actually, no, I think child 1 requires that, so that's fine. Actually, you know what? Let's just completely get rid of it for now, because we're going to use context. So let's go here, and we're going to go to the parent. Now what we get is we get this. Okay, cool. So now what we can do. All right, so this is where we're going to use useContext, and I'll explain exactly what it does in a bit. So to get useContext, just import useContext from this object over here from React. And remember, useContext, it is going to give us a global state. And this global state, we can assign it to a bunch of different components, and any component can just pick it up and take it and view what that state is. And so what we can do is to create that context. What we can do is say const, and we can say, well, whatever that context is. At this point, where the state is count, so we can say count context, and we can say this is equal to, and then we have to create the context. So what we can do here is actually, instead of useContext will use it in another component, but over here, we're going to create the context. So we can say create context, and then over here, we can assign it an initial value. So we'll assign an initial value of 0. Okay, cool. So this is terrific. And now what we do, so now we created the context, we created that global state, but now what we need to do is we need to wrap all the components that should have access to the state with this count context. And so what we want to ultimately do is take this useContext, and we can treat it as a component and just put it in here. So now over here, we have our context, and every component that is inside of this count context is going to have access to this state. So it's going to have access to this count. And so you can see that child 1 is going to have access to that count. And let's actually just get rid of this over here. So child 1 is going to have access to this, but also child 1 has child 2 within it. So child 2 is also going to have access, and child 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, etc. So now what we can do is, well, we can pass that state down. Now this right now over here, it's providing the state. So we can't just use context. We have to use useContext.provider because it's providing the state. And then over here, so let's get rid of that. Let's fix that a little bit. And then over here for the value, we can also assign it the value. Now, I always seem like it's kind of redundant to create the context and then assign it a value, and then over here to also assign it a value, but that's how it's done. But also, we also don't want it to be 0. We want it to be whatever the count is over here in the use state. So let's say this value is going to be the count. So again, anything in here is going to have access to this value. And so this is a far better way than prop drilling. Okay, cool. So now if we were to save it, terrific. And now, okay, how do we get access to it? Well, notice here, child 1, I'm not passing any props. So now what we can do in child 1 is use the useContext hook. So we can say import, and we can say useContext. So we can use context, and of course we're going to import this from React. So we're going to say useContext from React. And then what we want to do is, well, we want to use .context. So we want to get access to the state that this over here, this count context, is creating. Now the useContext hook has no idea, okay, which context you're talking about, because we can have multiple contexts out there. We're not subjected to just one. So we need to specify, okay, which context are we talking about? And then once it knows which context we're talking about, it's going to take the value from that context. And so to do that, what we can say here is const count. So this is going to be the variable that we want. Or we can say use context. And then in here, we have to provide the context that we created, which is this one. And so what we can do is we can just export this out, save it. And over here, we can just say count context from our parent. And now what we can do is just say count. And notice we did absolutely no prop drilling. And you can see that it works completely fine. And now without passing any props down, we can do the exact same thing to child 5. So over here, we can just say this. And let me just quickly auto import. In case you guys don't know, if you start typing the name, sometimes you get this over here and it just allows you to auto import it. Now over here, very, very simply, we have access to our count. Now useContext is not defined for some reason. Oh yeah, useContext is not defined. That makes sense. We should probably import useContext, and then over here, let us say from, and then from React. All right, cool. So you can see that that works completely fine. All right, and that's pretty much sums it up. One thing I just want to quickly reiterate, this context over here only is going to provide this value to any component that is within it. So any component that is a child of it. So child 1, and then child 1 of course has components like child 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're basically within this over here. Now if we had an outside component, if we said the app component, and what we want to do is we want to get the context for here, that wouldn't work. That would not work because the provider is not providing the value to the app component because it's not nested, it's actually the parent. Now, if we wanted global context, we could also just put it in there. But again, we can only provide it to the things that we have nested. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. If you don't, I was thinking of demoing it, but this video is taking very long. If you want, just go ahead and just try to use that useContext over here, and I promise you it will not succeed. I'll have to show you guys. I'll just show it to you. Let's go over here and let's just import, we're gonna import useContext just to show you that this wouldn't work. So we're gonna go import useContext, and we're gonna import that from React. And then over here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say const count, and we're gonna say const count, and then we're gonna say use context, and then over here we're gonna say the count context. So we're gonna have to auto import that in as well. Now, if we were to save this, it seems completely fine. But now, if we were to try to use this context somewhere, so let's just go over here and let's just go count. You can see that. So we get 0, but it's not updating. So you can see that it's not really working. Okay, cool. So that's pretty much it. And that sums up this crash course. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed.